So the scripture is Philippians 1, 3 through 11. First thing is we need to make sure we understand who Paul is and what the context of this letter is. So Paul is, of course, the author of many documents in the New Testament. He's a very important figure, though he wasn't a direct disciple of Jesus. He was an apostle after the fact who encountered the risen Christ. And after being struck down off his high horse as a Pharisee, he spent 3 days blind, is baptized, and then his eyes are opened and he is converted into the person that we know as Paul. He takes all of his Pharisaical zeal and he transforms it into the advancement of the gospel. Travels all over the ancient world and plants churches in all of these different places. One of those churches is a church in a place called Philippi, which is in Europe, in Macedonia, just north of Greece, far east from a lot of the other churches that Paul founds. But he founds this church, he plants this church rather in Philippi, and then sometime later, perhaps towards the end of his life, we're not 100% sure, Paul is imprisoned. He's imprisoned maybe in Ephesus, maybe Caesarea, maybe Rome. We don't know. It's not particularly important for this sermon. But suffice it to say, he's incarcerated. Miraculously, somehow, we don't know, the people in Philippi hear that Paul is in prison. So they send somebody, Epaphroditus, who comes with a care package, including some money. And when he gets there, he falls ill. He almost dies. Epaphroditus does. And he's miraculously saved. He's restored back to health. And perhaps it's Epaphroditus who is delivering this letter when he goes back to Philippi. Now, Paul is writing this letter, and he has a few things that he needs to do. He needs to, number one, let the people know what his condition is. They obviously care about him. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent an emissary to bring some food and supplies. So he wants to let them know I'm okay and reassure them that just because he's incarcerated doesn't mean that the gospel has been a failure. He says, listen, it's all right. I'm here in prison. But what I have found is that even to be in prison is a blessing because I can take the gospel to people who have never heard it before, namely the prison guards. And I've been doing just that. And after all, if I stay here and die, I get to be with Jesus. And that would be wonderful for me. But if I get to live, that's also awesome for everyone else because I can continue to do my work of spreading the gospel here on earth. And so he wants to reassure them that he's okay. He also wants to thank them for the gift that they sent. Then he wants to address some stuff that's going on. Number one, he wants to reassure them in the midst of a context that's not very friendly to the church. In other words, Philippi is a heavily pagan Gentile town. There could be some Judaizers or this opposition group to Paul who will come through the town and try to convince them that they all need to become Jewish first in order to be Christians. So he's kind of warning against that if it hasn't happened already. And then he knows that they're experiencing persecution from time to time and that it requires some suffering to be a Christian. He wants to give them some encouragement and hope. And then he also wants to help try to resolve some division and conflict that seems to be going on between two leaders in the church, which is Euodia and Syntyche. I believe that's how their names would be pronounced. That's how I'm going with it. So anyway, he writes this letter, and this letter is unlike any other letter in that it's just kind of filled with joy and thanksgiving. And for that reason, I really enjoy the letter. Now, it's important to see that there's different things that are happening to this church, and that those things that are happening to the church are similar to what is happening to every church. That things are a mixed bag. You can recognize the church in Philippi has some good things going for it. After all, they are apparently very generous, compassionate and hospitable, that they're very faithful, that they've endured this long. And after all, they sent somebody to go care for Paul. That speaks a great deal about their Christian character. So there's some really good, commendable things happening in this church. But there's also some trouble going on in the church. There's some conflict, apparently, and that could spread into some other members. And so, that happens in this church, and it happens in all of our churches. And then in this church, you see some pressures from the outside. And if you were to go to any church in the United States of America or other places in the world, I think what you would find is a similar situation where you have some good things. You have some people who are really living the faith. They're really living the gospel. They're really doing a good job. They're staying firm. They're faithful. They're hopeful. They're compassionate. They're generous. They're hospitable. All of those things. And you would find some not so good things, some shameful things, some conflict, some irresolved things, some recalcitrance to change, those kinds of situations. You would see that a lot of today's congregations have external forces that are pushing down on them, living in a context where, there's different worldviews competing with the Christian worldview. There are different organizations that are competing for our allegiance and our attention. There's other places where you can get community. And so there's places that are, competing for our time. There's all kinds of things that we face as a church. And the church that I'm in right now, in First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ of Danville, is no different. We have all kinds of things that we do right. I think that the fact that we did Church Under the Bridge last week, where we took a bunch of people all the way to Lexington, about an hour away, and we served the homeless population, people that were complete strangers, treated as neighbors. And we tried to feed and to worship and share our presence and our witness and share joy and celebration with folks we hadn't met before. We continue to do things like that in this community, which shows the compassion of this church, which I enjoy very much as a pastor. I believe that we're a very hospitable congregation. I personally have invited people with different colored hair and piercings and tattoos who dress in maybe not so nice church clothes, who come in, who have been embraced and they've been treated as brothers and sisters. And I see all kinds of people who come into this church for the first time or the first time in a long time, and they can feel that hospitality. They can feel that love that we have here. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And we're also very generous in a lot of different ways, which I think is great. There are some things, like any church, which are not so great. This church has a legacy and a history, and some of that legacy and history includes some division and some hurt feelings and people who have left the church over one issue or another, some people who have never come back. And there's still some hurt that remains because of those situations. There's certainly pressures from the outside, like at that church in Philippi. We live in a secular culture that has competing worldviews, clamoring for our attention and our time. And we also have an aging population, like many churches do in our denomination and other mainline Protestant denominations, where people are getting older, and we don't have as many young people coming in behind them. And so one day the math is just going to say, there has to be a change. Otherwise, this can't go on very much longer. There's certain things, and it just goes to show that there's kind of a mixed bag. And as leaders, when we deal with churches, and as leaders, when we deal with the community, we're always going to see ourselves in a situation with a mixed bag. Anytime you look out into the world, if you're honest and you have your eyes genuinely open, you're going to see good things and you're going to see bad things. And you're going to have an opportunity to speak to those things. Now, so what does Paul do in this letter? First of all, I have to point out that this portion of the letter is a thanksgiving. There are certain formats that people would use in the ancient world, and Paul uses that format, which is to put a thanksgiving early in the text. And the thanksgiving is traditionally when you would thank the gods, for life and providence and whatever. And Paul does that, but he doesn't thank the gods. He thanks the God of Jesus Christ. But look what he does here. He thanks God for them. He thanks God for the people. He thanks God for all of the virtues, for all the compassion, the hospitality, all that good stuff that is in them. He says, I thank my God for you every time that I remember you in my prayers. With joy and thanksgiving, he praises the congregation, and he tells the congregation how much he thanks God for them, which sets the tone for the entire letter. Now, here's the thing. There is a time and a place to admonish. And there's a time and a place to correct and to point out what's wrong. And I think any time that we go into our spheres of influence in this world, whether it's a pastor in a church or whether it's a disciple in the world, that we have an opportunity to choose how it is that we're going to communicate to the world. And look what Paul does. Instead of pointing out everything that's wrong, instead of doing what he had the right to do, which is to say, look at this. This is wrong. This needs to be fixed. Let's fix it right now, and here's how. How dare you live in such a way? And indeed, there are times in which Paul does that in his letters, but not today, because there was something about his context. There was something about the way he was living. There was something about a lifelong ministry and the wisdom that comes from that. There was something about being in a prison about having all his creature comforts stripped away from him, and having all of his hopeful expectations and optimism about the future taken away, and just be faced with the here and the now and what blessings were available right there. There was something about the place that he was and the gratitude that he was feeling and the joy that was surrounding him, that he decided, instead of pointing out that which was wrong and starting there, but rather to write a love letter to his people, to say, I can stand in a lot of different places of condemnation, of judgment, of the prophetic voice, but instead I choose to stand in joy. Instead I choose to stand in gratitude. Instead I choose to stand in thanksgiving. And this is what he says. He says, I thank God for all of you, and this is my prayer for you. I pray that God would cause the love that is inside of you to overflow with knowledge and with full insight, so that you might be able to decide what is right, so that on the day of Christ you are blameless and pure, having produced the harvest of righteousness, all for the glory and praise of God. Instead, he says, I don't choose to point out what's wrong with you, because I believe that everything that's right with you that comes from God is enough to overcome what is wrong. He says, I choose to focus on that love, and I hope that that love just overflows, that love that is creative, that love that is expressive, that love that is redeeming, that love that pulls us all together, that love that holds us not only to God, but holds us in a community, that love that defines us as a people. I pray that that love, that creative love, that redeeming love, that sustaining love would overflow with knowledge and insight, that you would be able to articulate that love, that you would be able to tell people, listen, I know that there are things inside of you that don't feel right, and that causes you to go into conflict with your sisters and brothers. But I'm here to tell you that whatever you think is wrong inside of you, God has made right. That chasm of distance between us and our Creator has been closed by Christ. That God has deemed it necessary and right to come down into our earth and to embrace us with those arms of love, and to make everything right, so that we, all of us, not just those in the covenant, but all of humanity, can be in right relationship with God through Christ. I pray that that love that holds you together would overflow with knowledge and full insight, so you would know how to communicate it, and you would know what to do, so that in any novel situation that comes up, you don't need to flip to the right page and say, what do we do in this situation or that situation? No, that all you need to do is ask yourself, what would love do? That is Paul's prayer for them. And my question to all of you is, what would happen if all of our disciple leadership, what would happen if our congregations and denominations, what would happen if the Church of Jesus Christ decided to lead the world like that? What would happen if we decided that we were going to sit around and we were going to be grateful for what God has done? And we decided we were going to be enveloped in all of that joy and praise. And that we were going to take all of that and we were going to use that as our prayer, that love would overflow with knowledge and full wisdom, all for the glory of God. What would the world look like if we decided to do love letter leadership? Amen.